Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is perceptions of the police. And, we talked earlier about preconceptions that young people have about why they may want to do the job and why they wouldn't want to do the job. What we're going to talk about now is kind of the broader public opinion about the police. And when we talked to people about their preconceptions about doing the job, a lot of their answers revolved around what the public perception is. Like, I would want to be a cop because people might be respectful to me or may admire me. Or I wouldn't want to be a cop because people are disrespectful or there's a stigma currently about the police. So we thought we should really address this topic and talk about those perceptions. So let's start with this one. Let's start with this guy's perception of the police, right? This is Costa Mesa, California. This is I guess a riot of some kind or another, and it appears his perception of the police isn't very good. What's interesting about this picture, among other things, in addition to how much he can bounce through the air like that, if you look at everybody else in the picture, I think every single other person in that picture is doing what? Taking a picture of him, right? So that's the picture you're going to see on Google Images. Not the thousands of other incidents where this isn't happening, but that's what you're going to see, right? And that's why he's doing it. He's doing it for the attention, and it's going to get the attention, and it's going to get media coverage, and it's going to get known, and it's going to start to give the impression publicly that lots of people feel this way about the police, okay? We have a much, much, much more common view, I guess, of the perception that people have of the police, at least here in Champlin, and that's this one. This is boxes of donuts and thank you notes and flowers and stuff that shows up at our police department on a very regular basis. That doesn't mean that we don't have a little bit of this. We actually have a guy a couple of years ago who jumped on one of our squad cars, and we charged him with damage to property. We were able to identify him through Facebook. I don't know if some of the cops here remember that one, but so it's not like we don't have this, but this is much, much more common, is we get approached frequently by people who say, I just want to thank you for what you're doing. And of course, there's no one taking pictures of that, except for me. And there's no one putting it on Google Images, and so you don't get that impression that there's that much support out there when you look at the media and you look what's reported. And, to be fair to the media, how newsworthy is that, right? I mean, what gets your attention more, that or that, right? So I'm not even going to get into whether anyone's at fault or whether the media is doing this right or not. I think this probably is newsworthy. It's just interesting how much news it gets when we see stuff like this almost every day, okay? But that does sort of leave a question then is, well, what really is the public opinion about police? So I'm going to make reference to a Gallup poll. Gallup is a very reputable polling firm. They have conducted a survey, a public poll since the 1960s that basically measured the public's opinion about the police. So the most recent version was conducted in 2016, and I'm going to read some of the results. The headline in the news release for the poll is, Americans' respect for police surges. And I'll read some more of the headline. 76% say they have a great deal of respect for the police in their area. Respect for law enforcement is up since 2015 among whites and non-whites. So you may get the impression that there's racial divides and there's differences of opinion, but according to the public poll, support for the police is up, actually, and if I read further, among all groups, all subgroups, all members of different political parties, races, age groups. Public support is up drastically. In fact, it is at its highest number since 1967, according to this poll. There again, I was aware of this. I heard this reported, but it wasn't reported anywhere near as widely as this guy. right? But the public opinion poll, and this is a national poll, really is more in line with this, which is what I was describing that we see, is people really being fairly outspoken about their support for what we're doing. Okay, let's talk some more, though, about public opinion. And in the survey we did of young people, there was and I don't know if it made it into that final version there, but the word stigma, the feeling that there's a stigma about the police. And I think everybody knows what that's pointing to is race. In fact, some of our respondents in our survey said they didn't want to get into law enforcement because they didn't want to be perceived as racist. So I think we need to talk about race really, factually. And I want to give you the police perspective as we see this issue. So let me talk first about this picture that you're seeing. This is from Baltimore. And this kind of arose out of an incident which originally happened in 2015. And let me just describe that a little bit. So in April of 2015, the Baltimore police had identified an area in the city where they wanted to add additional police presence due to some crime-related activity, including drug dealing. So there were officers assigned there, including some bike patrol officers, who spotted a young man named Freddie Gray. And they were familiar with Mr. Gray, and they were familiar that he had some previous contacts and arrests based on drug dealing on his part. And when they saw him and he saw them, they looked at each other, and Freddie Gray took off running away from them. And the cops developed some suspicion, well, he must be running because he's got drugs. That's what we're here looking for in the first place, so they gave chase. And the chase was fairly extensive. It took a while, and there were times when they were chasing him that they lost sight of him, and then, oh, there he is again, and eventually they caught up to him. There are some who feel that he was carrying drugs and perhaps ditched them during that chase, but no one knows. No drugs were recovered. When they did find him, they found a knife on him, which they believed was in violation of city code, so they arrested him for that. They took him into custody. They put him in a transport van, which is just how they transport prisoners in Baltimore. The transport van took him to the city jail, and somewhere between where the van picked him up and his arrival at jail, his neck was broken during the transport. He died from injuries associated with that broken neck several days later. He had been released, but it was a direct result of this injury that was sustained while he was in custody during that transport. To this day, the internal investigation at the Baltimore Police Department hasn't determined specifically exactly how his neck was broken, although they have seemed to focus on the idea that he wasn't seatbelted properly and that he had fallen over or some movement within that confined space in the van, and that his neck was broken at that time. They also had similar incidents in Baltimore previous to this where there were injuries during transport. And so they had put policies in place specifically requiring the officers to seatbelt people and secure them to prevent this from happening. So it seems very clear to me anyway, the policy wasn't followed, and as a result someone died of injuries that they sustained during that transport. And I would certainly think someone would be held accountable for that within the police department. And in fact, I hope they are. But to this point, the internal investigation hasn't been completed. Now, there are some additional reasons why that hasn't been completed. First of all, because the district attorney decided to charge 6 officers who were involved in the arrest or transport with crimes, and the crimes were ranged from false imprisonment to murder. And as these cases worked their way through court, basically the officers were found not guilty, and the judge, in fact, came out and said in his verdict from the bench what was described as a chastisement of the prosecution, and he said that not seatbelting someone is not a criminal act. It may be something for internal discipline, but he basically said to the prosecutors, you just don't have a case here, you haven't proven this. Well, the internal investigation, of course, is put on hold while this criminal proceeding happens, and somewhere in that time frame, the city held itself accountable and paid the family of Mr. Gray $6.4 million. So the city certainly held itself accountable for his death. Individual police officers who were involved in the arrest essentially were found to not have committed a crime, but the internal investigation still isn't complete. So it remains to be seen whether they will be held accountable in terms of their employment. After his death, there were many people who came to Baltimore insisting that this had something to do with his race, that essentially the police had targeted him or treated him the way they had because of his race. That may or may not be. What's interesting is Mr. Gray's African American. 3 of the 6 officers involved were African American, and the other 3 were not. The police chief in Baltimore is African American. Much of the police administration is African American, as is the mayor. So to say this is a racial incident, I guess everyone's entitled to their opinion, but there certainly are some factors that would bring that into doubt. The picture that you see here is this. So riots broke out in Baltimore. There was a lot of destruction of property, and at some point, the police decided to block off this street so the riots wouldn't progress down that street and cause more property damage. When all this was happening, the crowd that was rioting was very hostile towards the police, sometimes attacking them. And a line of residents of Baltimore, men, it appears in this picture, basically lined up between the rioters and the police, and essentially it said to the rioters, if you're going to attack the police, you're going to have to get through us first. I thought that was interesting, kind of an interesting dynamic there, who's protecting who. Kind of an encouraging sign that at least some of the residents wanted to stop this rioting as much as the police did. I'm going to show you a video about this whole race issue and police, and then we can discuss this a little bit further.
Does the truth matter? Not to groups like Black Lives Matter. That's tragic for many reasons, not the least of which is that Black lives are being lost as a result. When it comes to the subject of American police, blacks, and the deadly use of force, here is what we know. A recent deadly force study by Washington State University researcher Lois James found that police officers were less likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than unarmed white or Hispanic ones in simulated threat scenarios. Harvard economics professor Roland Fryer analyzed more than 1,000 officer-involved shootings across the country. He concluded that there is zero evidence of racial bias in police shootings. In Houston, he found that blacks were 24% less likely than whites to be shot by officers, even though the suspects were armed or violent. Does the truth matter? An analysis of the Washington Post's police shooting database and of federal crime statistics reveals that fully 12% of all whites and Hispanics who die of homicide are killed by cops. By contrast, only 4% of black homicide victims are killed by cops. But isn't it a sign of bias that blacks make up 26% of police shooting victims, but only 13% of the national population? It is not, and common sense suggests why. Police shootings occur more frequently where officers confront armed or violently resisting suspects. Those suspects are disproportionately black. According to the most recent study by the Department of Justice, although blacks were only about 15% of the population in the 75 largest counties in the U.S., they were charged with 62% of all robberies, 57% of murders, and 45% of assaults. In New York City, blacks commit over 3/4 of all shootings, though they are only 23% of the city's population. Whites, by contrast, commit under 2% of all shootings in the city, though they are 34% of the population. New York's crime disparities are repeated in virtually every racially diverse city in America. The real problem facing inner-city black communities today is not the police, but criminals. In 2014, over 6,000 blacks were murdered, more than all white and Hispanic homicide victims combined. Who is killing them? Not the police and not white civilians, but other blacks. In fact, a police officer is 18 and a half times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by a police officer. If the police ended all use of lethal force tomorrow, it would have a negligible impact on the black death by homicide rate. In Chicago, through just the first 6.5 months of 2016, over 2,300 people were shot. That's a shooting an hour during some weekends. The vast majority of the victims were black. During this same period, the Chicago police shot 12 people, all armed and dangerous. That's 0.5% of all shootings. Does the truth matter? If it does, here's a truth worth pondering. There is no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black lives matter than the police. The proactive policing revolution that began in the mid-1990s has dramatically brought down the inner city murder rate and saved tens of thousands of Black lives. Unfortunately, that crime decline is now in jeopardy. As I write in my book, The War on Cops, police officers are backing off of proactive policing in Black neighborhoods thanks to the false narrative that police officers are infected with homicidal bias. As a result, violent crime is going up. In cities with large Black populations, homicides in 2015 rose anywhere from 54% in Washington, D.C. to 90% in Cleveland. Overall, in the nation's 56 largest cities, homicides in 2015 rose 17%, a nearly unprecedented one-year spike. Many law-abiding residents of high-crime areas beg the police to maintain order, precisely the type of policing that the ACLU, progressive politicians, and the Obama Justice Department denounce as racist. This is tragic because when the police refrain from proactive policing, Black lives are lost. Lost because of a myth. The best research and data reach this conclusion. There is no evidence that police are killing Blacks just because they're Black. You now have the truth. Does it matter? I'm Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute for Prager University.
To subscribe to our YouTube channel, click here. To help keep our videos free, donate here.
Okay, I should comment on that video. There certainly is some political innuendo there, and that's not the purpose of this presentation. But and you certainly don't have to agree with everything said in that video in order to join law enforcement. I think the facts are the facts, the statistics are the statistics. There certainly is room for anyone who has a different view in our profession. I would say this, though, that the way that was described in terms of trying to drive down crime, in terms of the disproportionate contacts police have with different races, that is the prevalent view of police officers, all of whom who I've known in my career, and I think for obvious reasons, because they know the reasons why there's some disproportionality there. So certainly room for disagreement, but that tends to be the view from the police perspective. And I show that because I think it's important to know that, you know, if you had concerns about, I don't want to join a profession that's racist, then there was some wording up on our word cloud there kind of to that effect. This may be another way to look at that, to realize that really isn't the case.